victims and survivors sought compensation in Germany and some other countries after the war, and after in the immediate aftermath, there was return of property. There was no compensation that I know of. Compensation systems for people who had suffered loss of life and other things other than tangible property received compensation starting in the 60s, I believe, and then there have been renewed efforts at providing compensation after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
It might seem at first glance that the people most directly responsible for the death and depredation of the Holocaust should bear the economic burden of reparations. In other words, the prison guards at Auschwitz and Buchenwald, or police officers charged with rounding up undesirables in the Third Reich, feel like the dispositionist actors in the Shoah. But can we really say that these people were acting according to their own preferences and desires? Or were they moved by powerful situational forces beyond their control? It is a troubling question that Christopher Browning addresses in his seminal work, Ordinary Men. Browning focused on the notoriously brutal Police Battalion 101, who not only loaded Jews onto trains bound for concentration camps, but also executed thousands of Jews in Polish forests. Browning argues convincingly that these men were neither violent nor overtly anti-Semitic prior to the Holocaust. In fact, most were regular German citizens, doctors, lawyers, and craftsmen. But an institutional hierarchy that separated them from the harms they inflicted, a natural deference to authority, and deep-seated anti-Semitism that ran throughout much of German society turned ordinary men into monsters. Browning ends his book by admitting, much to his own horror, that if he had been a German citizen when Hitler came to power in 1933, he might well have been a Nazi too. If the people closest to the death and destruction were more like the participants in the Milgram experiment, it seems that the German government, the institution responsible for producing the situation that drove these men to evil, is the truly culpable party.
More action occurred when a new generation came into power, and then another new generation came into power. So there was a lot of, as I understand it, a lot of denial of responsibility in the immediate aftermath of the war. Everybody was a victim after the war. Nobody was a perpetrator. And it was in the 60s, a new generation comes into power in Germany, and sort of they won't take that line anymore.
The question of whom to repay also resisted clarity. The recipients of restitution were as many and varied as the associated theories of restitution. Survivors, estates, descendants, and even the nation of Israel were among those that received Holocaust restitution payments. Whether to accept West German money or not, in fact, divided the fledgling country of Israel and the Knesset, its parliament. Despite fierce objections to accepting what many considered blood money, Israel ultimately approved the Luxembourg Agreement, in which it received roughly $6.5 billion adjusted for inflation. Survivors received regular checks to compensate them for decreased earning potential. Specific stolen artwork was restored either to survivors or estates. Seized real estate was compensated for, and even the children of survivors who had themselves not lived through the Holocaust received payments as restitution for negatively impacting their circumstances. Ultimately, the number and variation in the recipients reflected the magnitude of the tragedy and its far-reaching effects.
So a big lawsuit against the German government right now could be launched right now by survivors. I could launch one. I mean, I'm a descendant of Holocaust survivors, but it would be immediately dismissed on sovereign immunity grounds. Okay. On the other hand, if Germany had a piece of art or a tangible piece of property that belonged to my family, I could possibly bring a lawsuit to get it because there are legal limits on sovereign immunity for limitations for property claims. So it just depends on sort of the legal category that you're falling under.
Our final consideration is now the memo of the check. What message is being sent to its recipients? The most important part of the memo is recognition of the damage done by the Holocaust and the victim's right to a remedy. That alone is a powerful message. It recognizes the humanity of Holocaust victims and their entitlement to justice. By allowing payment to one generation of descendants of the victims, the restitution payments also send the memo that the intergenerational effects of the Holocaust are acknowledged and validated as a form of damage.
An event like the Holocaust, trying to fit it into models of tort law, in one way, even an event as monstrous as that, can be fit relatively easily within the conventional categories. I mean, again, wrongful death, imprisonment, false imprisonment, seizure, wrongful seizure of property, and so forth. All of those are, rather easily handled by tort law, subject to things like time limits. Sometimes statute of limitations comes into play in these cases, and also subject to things like sovereign immunity. If you're suing the state rather than a private party, you run into some state immunity questions. But otherwise, it's not that hard to fit even a monstrous event like this into conventional tort categories. What is harder is to sort of fit it into conventional justifications of tort, especially in an economic analysis. The economic analysis of tort law is for things like, the business world or other parts of sort of, the ordinary operation of civil society. But, massive sort of convulsions like this, it seems to me, are much harder. Massive injustices, massive human rights violations are much harder to sort of fit into the conventional story about deterrence. It seems to me if you use the tort apparatus, you're using it, realistically, you're using it not for economic reasons, not for cost minimization reasons, not for deterrence reasons, but primarily to express, retributive justice, corrective justice, sometimes compensation.
Does a restitution payment made to the victims of the Holocaust imply a finite quantification of their losses? Does it insult its recipient as much as it may have helped financially by artificially capping the damages they can legitimately claim to have suffered, including even their emotional trauma?
I think you should ask the victims. I mean, if they want nothing, if nothing were the right kind of compensation, then they wouldn't sue. I think if they sue and want compensation, I think it demeans them to sort of say, no, the right amount for you to collect is zero because that expresses your true humanity or something. I think it's for them to decide whether compensation is dehumanizing or not.